The image that you see is of Venerable Henriette Delille, the founder of the Sisters of the Holy Family and their first Mother Superior. She was a 19th century woman. So we have photographs of her, and the difficult thing about these photographs is that they're very early, and it's sort of hard to tell exactly what her skin tone was. So you're actually going to see a lot of different depictions of Henriette that depict her with varying degrees of darkness or lightness of skin for reasons that we'll describe here in a little bit. Before I say anything more about her life, I'm going to say a little bit more about the French Creole society into which she was born in New Orleans. So French colonialism then was one of the efforts of expanding the the authority or the influence of France around the world from the 16th century until the 20th century, thereabout. Colonialism, more generally then, is the expansion of the influence of any European nation states from the 15th to the 20th century. It involved both the spread of the Christian faith, what is called evangelization, and then also the sometimes violent imposition of European cultures on colonized peoples. This is often the negative sense that is associated with the term colonization or colonialism today. The French colonial empire included a wide swath of the world. Included Quebec, much of Western Africa, some of Southeast Asia, and some of the Caribbean islands, and other little spots then that you can see around on the map there. So the French colonies often deployed slave labor as a means of enriching mainland France, especially in the Caribbean. There you'll see especially Western Hispaniola there is Haiti. It's the French-speaking then part of that island. I'll say a little bit more about Haiti and New Orleans here in a moment then, because they're the closest parts of slave-holding Catholicism to modern-day United States. In those, it's then also then the origin of what we call modern Creole culture in New Orleans. So in those parts of the world, we see the development of something like a caste system, something that you might hear about maybe in India, but the French had it too. There was a sort of gradation of society from slaves at the bottom of the totem pole or the bottom of the ladder upwards and through to what are called the Grand Blanc at the top. These were often French citizens who lived in France. The next rung down then would have been what are called the Petit Blanc. They were individuals who were white but also lived in the colonies and often were in charge of running like the plantations, for instance. Then below the Petit Blanc were gradations of mixed race and then free blacks, as well as then all the way back down to black slaves. One of the features of this system of different rungs on a ladder is what I've come to describe as the gamification of race. What I mean by that is that by creating different stratifications of society, it gave everybody something toward which they could strive, right? So even like the Petit Blanc weren't the real owners of the plantations, but they could hope maybe someday that they could return to France and become one of the real Grand Blancs, one of the people who really owned the plantations. Mixed race folk could hope to sort of gain a little bit more authority, that others might see them more like the Petit Blanc, right? And it goes all the way down. In other words, what it did is that it gets what you see on the screen as like user engagement, so to speak, right? Everybody bought into the system, even though, and it, in a sense, it also extended authority or extended rights to individuals who, in like the strict sort of white and black system in the United States, they didn't have those rights, but it still didn't give all the rights to everybody. And so in that way, it's really almost more insidious than some of the sort of strict black and white racism that happened in the English colonies. So you'll see here in a moment how that affected Henriette's own life. She was born in New Orleans in 1813, March 11th. Her father was a French man who was not married to her mother. Her mother was 1/4 African descent, so of mixed descent. And then Henriette, in turn, was then 1/8 of African descent. And it kept her sort of in the mixed tiers of this Creole society that existed in the area at the time. In the middle tiers, in other words, of this ladder. Creole society at the time had a system known as plissage, which was a way for like up-and-coming young French men to take like temporary wives from the mixed-race population in and around New Orleans. This was a way for the women themselves to help. They climbed the ladder by engaging in these relationships, but the men could essentially say, "Okay, I'm done with this. I'm going to go back to France and actually marry somebody now," and leave them there, at least physically, even if they might have offered some financial support to them after they left, as a part of the agreement that they entered into with these women. So Henriette came from one of those relationships, and then was also in turn selected for one of them, probably in her somewhere in her teens, probably pretty early, because there's evidence that she may have had 2 boys from one of these relationships by the time that she was 19. But both of these boys appear to have died. Tragic. I mean, it's a mess, right? It's a messy situation. After the death of these boys, then, Henriette was confirmed as a Catholic, and by the age of 24, she wrote about a deepening experience of her faith. And in turn, then, she began a lay society called the Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Henriette started this group in part because, as mixed race, she was not eligible to join the religious orders, the Catholic religious orders of the time. Like the rest of Southern society at the time, even Catholic religious orders did not practice racial equality. With her fellow workers, Henriette went out of their way to work to educate slave children well before the outbreak of the Civil War. Henriette's closest family members were upset by this decision because it effectively outed her whole family as mixed race, which was something, again, that they're all trying to hide in a sense, like they want to appear as white as they could. Their appearance, they could pass as white, all of them, Henriette included. Moreover, educating slaves in the early 19th century was a politically fraught activity. Slaveholders commonly recognized that an educated slave was a more dangerous one, or at least one who would not be as productive as an uneducated one. So there was all kinds of efforts to try to keep slaves uneducated. Henriette's order was eventually officially recognized as the Sisters of the Holy Family, which was one of the only American religious orders before the Civil War that did not own slaves. Right? That means almost all of the other religious orders, Catholic religious orders in the United States at the time, owned them. Though her order also did have a bit of what we could call a bit of a civil war of its own, when a formerly enslaved woman attempted to enter the order. There was a division within the order as to whether they should admit a formerly enslaved woman or not. Henriette then served in this capacity with this order for a number of years, I believe over 20 years, and died during the Civil War in 1862. She never lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation. Henriette could have stood on the sidelines, right, enjoying the favors and benefits that came with her sort of middle space in this tiers of the society, and she could have lived a relatively comfortable life. But instead, she chose to identify herself with the lower castes of French Creole society and work to raise them up the ladder. Instead of climbing it, she pulled those below her upward. So what can we learn from this, right? How often do we have the opportunity to make small choices between the easy, comfortable way through life and the harder, at times unpleasant work of lifting up the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized? How easy is it to turn a blind eye to situations we encounter in our life and say, I'm glad I'm not in their situation? Instead of saying what we could say, like, what could I do to help them through their difficulties, to help raise them up? In the image that was composed by our artist Aaron Wee, you'll see a couple of symbols that help identify Henriette. First, you'll see a pencil, right? She was an educator, and she was an educator for all, right? All comers, no matter where they were on the ladder of French Creole society in her time, from the top all the way down to slaves at the bottom. And again, this was controversial, and it was a threat to some of the slave system that was around her. We'll also see in her ear some African-inspired jewelry. Josephine's great-grandmother was African. I think that's the right number of generations. Her earliest religious community, as I mentioned, was dedicated to the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And in that Jewish celebration, right, here's an image of the presentation of Mary at the temple. In that Jewish celebration, there would have been the sacrifice of a lamb and a dove. And so you'll see the lamb and the dove if you look very closely in that piece of jewelry. And thus, the jewelry is also a representation of her devotion to Mary. As a final piece of further study, there's a book out now that highlights the lives of 6 black Catholics who are on the road to sainthood, right? There's the name of the book. Henriette, you'll see her in the lower right-hand corner of this image here. And you can read about a number of other prominent figures in the American Catholic Church who are being held up right now as examples of virtue and holiness, even in the midst, for many of them, of racism, slavery, and other obstacles to living a life of holiness and virtue. So let us all pray for the intercession of Venerable Henriette Delille, and hope for the miracles that will be needed to advance her cause to the next stages of her canonization.